11 miles off the California coast, Anacapa Island rises into year-round Pacific fog. From any approaching vessel, it looks like three ridges of dark volcanic rock. The cliffs are vertical on three sides, dropping straight into the kelp below. There is no beach, no harbor, and no flat ground anywhere on the island. The only way ashore in calm conditions is a steel ladder bolted to the cliff. In any real swell, that ladder closes and the island becomes completely unreachable. What made Anacapa matter for thousands of years was what nested there rather than what grew. Seabirds colonized the cliff ledges and crevices to breed away from mainland predators. One species in particular had no other reliable breeding ground along the California coast. The Xanthus's murrelet is a black and white seabird barely larger than a starling. It spent most of its life on the open Pacific, invisible from any shore. It came to land only at night to lay eggs in dark rock crevices. Anacapa was one of the last places on Earth where it still did this in numbers. Ornithologists had split the Xanthus's murrelet into two distinct populations by the time the crisis peaked. One nested on the Baja California islands to the south, the other on the Channel Islands. Anacapa and Santa Barbara Island together held the largest share of the northern population. Lose those two colonies, and the bird did not have a fallback range to retreat into. There was no mainland population to reseed the islands if the island birds disappeared. Whatever happened on those cliffs would decide the subspecies' trajectory for the whole California coast. That made Anacapa's problem bigger than one island's bookkeeping. The murrelet's breeding system was built for an island where nothing dangerous lived on the ground. Eggs incubated for 32 days deep inside crevices that raptors and gulls could not enter. The chicks left the crevice before they could fly, on their second night inside it. The parents called from the water below the cliff in total darkness. The chicks jumped, fell to the sea, and began their lives offshore immediately. This system required one condition: nothing in the crevice could reach the bird from behind. For thousands of years on Anacapa, nothing threatened the birds from the ground. Island birds that evolved without ground predators have no behavioral response to them. They do not flush when a rat approaches in the dark of a rock crevice. They have no instinct that reads the scent as something to move away from. The murrelet, which had never encountered a ground mammal on Anacapa, held still on the egg. That stopped being an advantage sometime in the early 1940s. Sustained shipping traffic along the California coast expanded sharply during the Second World War. Anacapa had a Coast Guard lighthouse station with supply vessels arriving at regular intervals. The best reconstruction places the arrival around 1942 or 1943 from a supply ship at the cliff. Black rats, rarest, are smaller and more agile than the common Norway rat. They climb vertical rock faces as naturally as they run along flat ground. They navigate complete darkness using vibration and scent, covering ground invisible to any daytime survey. A single female produces 4 to 5 litters per year, with 5 or 6 pups in each. A founding population of 10 can exceed 10,000 animals within 5 years at that rate. On Anacapa, conditions were ideal: no predators, no competitors, and food incubating in open crevices. Nobody logged the rats' arrival at the time, because nobody was looking for them. Supply runs to a lighthouse station were not treated as a biosecurity risk in the 1940s. That thinking was standard practice across almost every inhabited island in the world at the time. A rope, a gangplank, or a cargo net was often the only barrier between ship and shore. Rats are proficient swimmers over short distances and even better climbers on mooring lines. On Anacapa, the geography did the rest of the work once the first pair got ashore. Vertical cliffs that kept out every large predator were no obstacle for an animal built for climbing. The same terrain that had protected the murrelet for 10,000 years now protected the rat instead. The murrelet held its position on the egg while the rat moved in and took the egg. By the late 1960s, biologists visiting Anacapa were noting the collapse of chick production in surveys. Sections of the island with highest rat activity returned near zero fledgling counts year after year. The adults still arrived each spring and claimed the same crevices they had always used. The eggs were laid and incubated. The chicks were not surviving to reach the water. What observers could document was a colony breeding continuously and producing almost nothing. Channel Islands National Park was created in 1980, with seabird protection stated as a priority. The murrelet decline had been documented for 15 years before the park was created. It was documented for another 20 years after the park existed, and nothing changed. Every alternative to Brotifacum was evaluated through the 1990s, and none scaled to the island's terrain. The murrelet surveys ran continuously. The population kept declining. The rats were never addressed. Brotifacum had been used for aerial island rat eradications in New Zealand from the mid-1970s. By 1990, more than 40 islands had been treated and their recovery outcomes monitored. Campbell Island, 11,000 hectares of subantarctic terrain, was cleared of Norway rats in 2001. Within 2 years, southern royal albatrosses bred there for the first time in over a century. Big South Cape Island showed the cost of arriving too late. Ship rats reached that New Zealand island in 1962, apparently from a stranded fishing vessel. Within 18 months, field teams watched the greater short-tailed bat vanish from its last known stronghold. The Stead's bush wren went with it, along with island populations of 2 other endemic bird species. A rescue operation caught and relocated some of the surviving wildlife to rat-free islands nearby. It saved several species from extinction outright, but arrived after the fastest losses had already happened. New Zealand's conservation agency treated Big South Cape as the founding case study of the entire field. Every island program that followed was designed around the same lesson: the clock runs whether you act or not. The founders of that program used Big South Cape as a permanent reminder of what delay costs. Campbell Island's albatross recovery and Big South Cape's losses were 2 data points from the same method. One showed what removal accomplishes, the other showed what waiting costs. The methodology had been proven. The question in California was whether it could survive the courts. Animal rights organizations had signaled that any rodenticide use on federal land would face challenge. The park commissioned more studies instead. Population models were built and updated each survey year. Trapping required flat terrain, and Anacapa had none. Live capture at scale had no comparable precedent. Repellents had no field data against established island rodent populations. Every option that avoided Brotifacum was insufficient. Every option that used it was deferred. Some of the hesitation was procedural rather than scientific. A federal agency proposing to drop poison across a national park unit invites review at every level. Interior Department sign-off, Fish and Wildlife Service consultation, and state coastal permits all stacked up in sequence. Each review added months, and each edition gave opponents another point to challenge later. Staff turnover inside the park added its own drag, since new biologists had to relitigate old ground. None of this was unique to Anacapa. Every rodenticide proposal on public land in the U.S. faced the same stack. What made Anacapa different was that someone finally treated the stack as a problem to solve, not just endure. By 2000, confirmed breeding pairs on East Anacapa had dropped below 150. The park's own modeling estimated 8 to 12 years remained before the colony fell below replacement level. Past that threshold, removing the predator doesn't reverse the decline. The breeding stock is too small. The birds keep arriving and keep laying eggs, and the count keeps falling regardless. The window was still open in 2000. The report was clear that it would not stay open. Faulkner read that number in 2000 and started building the case in 1999. Kate Faulkner had been the wildlife biologist for Channel Islands National Park since the mid-1990s. She came to the position from fieldwork on California condors. The Condor program was one of the most politically fraught recovery efforts in U.S. history. She had read every murrelet survey the park had produced and the full New Zealand eradication literature. She was not uncertain about whether an aerial bait drop would work. She was focused on getting one done inside the constraints that had stopped every previous attempt. Colleagues who worked with her on the Condor program described a similar pattern in her approach there. She treated legal and political obstacles as design constraints, not as reasons the project could not proceed. The Condor program had taught her that a species-saving intervention can die in committee just as easily as in the field. It had also taught her which kinds of documentation actually moved a stalled decision forward. Population viability models mattered less to opponents than a credible, monitored plan for measuring harm afterward. She carried that lesson directly into how she structured the Anacapa proposal from its earliest drafts. In 1999, she began meeting with the organizations most likely to file legal challenges. She met with the Fund for Animals and the Humane Society of the United States separately. The organizations told her they would file a challenge regardless of what the EIS showed. What those meetings gave her was the exact structure of every argument they would make in court. She could now address each objection inside the EIS before any lawsuit was filed. The EIS took 2 years and covered ground no previous U.S. island eradication had covered. It addressed marine mammal exposure risk at a level no comparable operation had been required to document. It modeled raven and raptor mortality using actual Brotifacum tissue half-life data from controlled studies. It proposed a 5-year post-operation monitoring protocol for every vertebrate on or near the island. Nest cameras covered all 47 confirmed murrelet crevice sites. Annual marine transects were included as well. Every metric that would later show the recovery had been set as a pre-operation baseline. The EIS also had to address Brotifacum itself, since the compound is not a gentle poison by design. It is an anticoagulant that works over several days, which is precisely why it functions well against rats. A rat that dies immediately after eating bait teaches other rats in its colony to avoid that bait entirely. A slower-acting compound lets a colony consume a lethal dose before any animal shows symptoms and warns the rest. That same delay is what creates the secondary exposure risk for predators and scavengers that eat the dying rats. The EIS modeled that risk explicitly, using tissue half-life data instead of the rougher estimates used in earlier reviews. It accepted a bounded, documented raven and raptor mortality risk rather than pretending the compound was harmless. That honesty became one of the EIS's strongest points once the case reached review, precisely because it hid nothing. When it was filed in 2001, nothing comparable had been produced in the national park system. Faulkner's team had spent 2 years building documentation designed to survive every anticipated objection. The public comment period drew responses from both sides of the debate in large numbers. Some objected to any use of poison on principle, regardless of the target or the documented outcome elsewhere. Others worried about non-target mortality among Anacapa's own native deer mice, a genuinely separate population. The EIS addressed that directly, proposing captive holding of a mouse founder population during the operation. Roughly 100 deer mice were live-trapped and held off-island through the bait window, then released back. That single design choice answered one of the most commonly repeated objections before it reached a courtroom. It was the kind of granular problem-solving that a 2-year preparation window made possible. The Fund for Animals and the Humane Society filed their injunction in October 2001. The federal court reviewed the EIS documentation and denied the injunction in November 2001. Faulkner had until the end of February before the murrelets returned to the island. She contracted with specialists who had performed aerial bait operations in New Zealand on comparable terrain. The helicopter was fitted with a GPS-controlled spreader calibrated to within a few meters. Brotifacum bait was formulated at 50 parts per million and dyed green to reduce bird attraction. Every section of the 163-acre island had been mapped for rat activity concentration before the drop. On December 29, 2001, The helicopter made its first pass over East Anacapa at first light. The spreader ran for 3 hours and covered every mapped section of the island. A second drop 6 weeks later addressed survivors and second-generation animals. 6 monitoring stations found no live rats after the first drop. After the second drop in February 2002, every station returned the same result. The island had been worked over by rats for 60 years. In 2 mornings of flying, the island had been cleared completely. 2 ravens found poisoned rat carcasses after the drop and died from secondary exposure. The loss had been predicted in the EIS and accepted as part of the documented operational cost. Within 2 breeding seasons, new ravens had moved into the island's territory. The Merlet news took longer to arrive, but was harder to argue with when it did. The spring 2002 survey placed nest cameras at 47 confirmed crevice sites across East Anacapa. These were the same sites monitored in previous years to establish a comparison baseline. In 2001, those 47 sites had produced 1 confirmed fledgling across the entire breeding season. Camera footage from 2001 showed rats active at more than 20% of monitored nest events. In spring 2002, those same 47 sites produced more than 20 confirmed fledglings across the season. No rats appeared on any camera between March and July. No rats appeared at any monitored site for the entire March to July season. The island's cliff terrain had made grid trapping nearly impossible for 60 years. The aerial drop had covered all of it in a single 3-hour morning. The 2003 survey added 30 previously abandoned crevice sites to the monitoring program. Merlets had returned to locations field records showed hadn't been occupied since the late 1980s. By 2004, Merlet activity had expanded to parts of the island not surveyed in years. The 2005 confirmed breeding pair count had nearly doubled the figure recorded before the operation. The trend held through El Niño years and ran past every projection made before December 2001. Birds were using crevices that field records showed had not been occupied since the late 1980s. The merlets were the target. What followed them was in no planning document. Brown pelicans had been nesting on West Anacapa in numbers considered stable for decades. In 2004, researchers found pelican nest success climbing past any level in the historical record. Rat activity logs revealed multiple confirmed events of rats entering active pelican nesting areas at night. The rats were not attacking adults. They were taking eggs from open platform nest edges. The pelican nests on an exposed ledge. Its eggs are accessible from every angle. No one had connected the egg losses to predation because no one had been watching at night. The colony had been declining at a rate that looked like natural variation. With the rats gone, it grew by roughly 28% over the next 3 breeding seasons. Storm petrels nested in soil burrows on East Anacapa and weighed less than 50 grams each. Burrows cannot be inspected during incubation without disturbing the adult and risking nest abandonment. Pre-eradication hatching success surveys have returned consistently poor numbers without a confirmed cause. After 2002, petrel hatching success roughly doubled by 2004 and kept improving through subsequent years. When the rats were removed, the petrels produced chicks at rates consistent with the absence of predation. The island's night lizard, a species found almost nowhere else on Earth, showed its own quiet shift. Rats compete with small reptiles for the same insects, seeds, and soft plant material near the surface. Post-eradication surveys found higher lizard density in areas that had previously logged the heaviest rat activity. Nobody had proposed monitoring the lizard population as a justification for the eradication. It became one more line in a growing list of species that had been suppressed without anyone measuring it. Botanists surveying the island's native plant community noted similar shifts in seedling survival within a few seasons. Rats had been eating seed heads directly off several native shrub species before they could disperse. Once that pressure lifted, several plant populations that field notes described as sparse began filling back in. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together, it was a picture of an island unclenching all at once. The marine response was documented in published research several years after the operation. Seabirds that feed at sea carry open ocean nutrients back to the island in their waste. More birds nesting more successfully meant more nutrient input into the water directly below the cliff face. Kelp density surveys below the East Anacapa nesting zones showed measurable increases in subsequent years. Fish surveys found higher juvenile rockfish counts in kelp beds adjacent to the recovering seabird zones. Control sites away from active nesting areas showed no comparable changes in the same monitoring period. The kelp density gains were concentrated directly below the cliff sections where seabird recovery was fastest. The same nutrient connection had been documented in New Zealand on rat-cleared islands. None of this had been proposed in the EIS or cited as justification in the legal case. The murrelet was the argument. Everything else was the island's own accounting once the pressure lifted. Researchers studying the broader pattern eventually gave it a name: the trophic cascade of island restoration. A single suppressed predator can hold an entire food web below its natural ceiling for decades without anyone noticing. Remove that one pressure and species at several different levels respond at once, on their own separate timelines. Seabirds recover first, because their losses were the most direct and the most visible in the historical record. Reptiles and plants recover more quietly, because their suppression was never dramatic enough to draw scientific attention. Marine systems recover last, because nutrient cycling through bird guano takes seasons to show up in kelp density surveys. None of those timelines were predicted with precision in the Anacapa EIS, because none of them were the point of it. The EIS existed to justify removing one pressure from one bird. Everything downstream of that was the island's own math. A 2008 global review of 48 island operations found secondary species recovery in 79% of sites. Cost per breeding pair, across all improving species, was lower than any alternative in the dataset. The Anacapa operation cost approximately $1.3 million across EIS work, the bait drops, and monitoring. Calculated across all recovering species, the cost per outcome figure came out lower than projected alternatives. It was also lower than the park had spent on murrelet monitoring programs through the deferred 1990s. Faulkner presented the Anacapa results at the Society for Conservation Biology in 2004 and again in 2006. The EIS she built became the working template for Park Service rodent eradications across the country. Santa Barbara Island completed its own operation in 2008 using the same legal framework and design. Lehua Island in Hawaii cleared rats in 2017, citing the Anacapa precedent in its environmental review. The approach spread well beyond California waters over the following 2 decades. Rat Island in Alaska's Aleutian chain was cleared in 2008, in an operation that drew on Anacapa's monitoring design. That island's name was changed afterward to Hawadax, restoring an Aleut term used before the rats ever arrived. South Georgia Island in the South Atlantic ran what became the largest rodent eradication ever attempted, finishing in 2018. Pipits and pintails that had not bred on the island's rat-affected sections in living memory returned within a few seasons. Palmyra Atoll in the Central Pacific cleared its rats in 2011, and native tree seedling survival rates tripled within 3 years. Each operation added its own monitoring data to a global data set that kept confirming the same pattern. Remove the introduced predator on a scale the terrain allows, and the island's own species do the rest of the work. East Anacapa has been rat-free for more than 2 decades since December 29, 2001. The Xanthus's murrelet population has grown in every monitoring year except 2, both El Niño years. The confirmed breeding pair count is now several times the figure recorded before the operation. The storm petrels are using burrow sites they had not occupied in at least 3 decades. The pelicans nest successfully on ledges that rat incursions had made unpredictable for years. The kelp below the most active nesting cliffs is denser than any pre-eradication measurement from those sites. The cliff faces that had been silent for 60 years are no longer silent in late spring. The murrelet call, a rapid high whistle, now carries across the water before sunrise. Faulkner closed the distance between knowing what needs to happen and making it happen. The island has been answering that question clearly and continuously ever since. For 6 decades, the murrelet collapse was managed with genuine precision. Surveys were thorough. Models were accurate. The data kept getting more unambiguous each year. Through all of it, the rat population was never touched. In 8 weeks across 2 winter months, it was gone. 2 breeding seasons later, the murrelet was recovering at rates no prior intervention had produced. 5 years after that, species never named in the original problem statement were rebuilding quietly. The pelicans came back, the storm petrels came back, the kelp came back below the cliffs. The same sequence has followed every major island rat eradication in the historical record. Target species recover. Adjacent species recover without anyone specifically targeting them. Marine systems below recovering seabird colonies respond to the nutrients the birds restore. The gap between the first documented collapse and the December 2001 operation was not a knowledge gap. Every fact needed to justify the operation was sitting in a Park Service filing cabinet by the late 1980s. What was missing was someone willing to spend 2 years turning that evidence into something a court could not unwind. That is a slower and less dramatic kind of work than a helicopter drop, but it is the work that mattered most. The bait spreading over the cliffs in December 2001 was the visible ending to a story built almost entirely out of paperwork. Faulkner closed that distance in the winter of 2001 and 2002. The island has been answering clearly and continuously ever since. Visitors who land on Anacapa today rarely know any of this history. They see a fog-bound island with birds wheeling over the cliffs and kelp swaying in the water below. What they are looking at is the far end of a 60-year argument about whether documentation is worth the delay. The murrelets settling into their crevices each spring are not aware they are a case study. They are simply doing what the island has let them do again, after 6 decades of not being able to. That is the part the surveys, the models, and the legal briefs were always trying to make room for.